I did my report on the National Indian Forested Resource Management Act of 1990. And this legislation was written with the Intertribal Forest Council and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. In the early 80s, there was a couple major Supreme Court cases with Native Americans and their timberland holdings. White Mountain Apache Tribe versus Bracker in 1980, and then the United States versus Mitchell in 83. And they both found that the United States was not fulfilling its trust obligation to timberland holding Native Americans, and that they were being double taxed. So the Intertribal Forest Council formed with 11 tribes at that time, and they met for symposiums and went over all the hundreds of treaties that had been signed between the United States government and different tribes that were timberland holding tribes. And their main goal was legislation versus litigation, because there weren't a lot of resources for them to keep going to court over these issues. So they wanted to have a real concrete legislation that could help them navigate their timberland resources more effectively. And this legislation passed with ample bipartisan support. It was closely written with the lawyers from the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Intertribal Council, the Intertribal Forest Council, ITC. And the major issues that it was addressing was the issue of being double taxed, the trespassing that was occurring, and the deductions that the United States government was, they put a cap, 10% deductions, and they more closely enforced the rules on that. And it's an unusual situation legally, because it's all gearing towards making the United States government fulfill its trust obligations to the Native American people. Reservation land is owned by the United States government and managed with the Department of Interior, specifically the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So it's owned by the government, and it's held in trust for Native American tribes that are bound to the land by Congress. And so the state government has no authority with Native American tribes. So this is real unusual language where it's mandating the U.S. government. And it affects the tribes in timberland regions. The biggest holding is the Navajo in the Southwest, and in the Pacific Northwest, there's 75 tribes that hold 18 million acres, all told, mostly in the west of the United States. And it's the Bureau of Indian Affairs that is the implementing authority for this legislation. And what the major points were in the act were creating third-party evaluations of the forest land. So every 10 years since 93, there's been a third-party scientific evaluation collecting data, and that has been the most successful part of the bill, is having this 30-year-old data on the management of these 18 million acres. And what they're finding is that the Native Americans are taking care of the healthiest forests in the United States, from very, very old techniques. And half of the legislation was geared toward educating their own foresters within their communities, so that tribal people will have the skills to hold their timberland resources and manage them for sustained yields into perpetuity.